Hello. So I believe that I'm on this new platform, although this video is being cross-posted to the Educating for Change Facebook, and maybe one day we will get these videos up on YouTube. That's a project for another day. So I don't know who's going to be coming on board. It is my privilege to be here on the New Jersey's Community Colleges page, share with you a story. It is also a privilege to be wearing a t-shirt with short sleeves during the snowy days. It is worth knowing, sorry, I'm looking out my window. It is worth knowing, of course, that these videos, for those of you who've not been here before, are meant to be informal. Not entirely informal, but the idea that we should literally just be able to talk history and whatever without making a huge deal about it, to learn, to understand, to know people. So I take my research and preparation very seriously and then move forward from there. I see one person has arrived. I'm worried that because of this change in location, that some of my traditional viewers will not be here. Plus, of course, I changed to Thursdays after weeks doing Wednesdays when I hit a couple of roadblocks in terms of preparation for these videos, because I do indeed prepare to get these done. So now that I see a few more people, I am going to begin how I begin every video, which is sort of a boilerplate statement or assertion or argument, if you will. And pretty much it has to do with a reality that we are facing in our society today that we need to discuss and address, and that is the flow and the flood of misinformation and the seeming inability of individuals to critically evaluate the information that is being given to them. And so one of the things I like to say every time is that we need to always look at whatever someone is telling us, whatever information is being shared with us. Hold on. All right, 6, sorry. Someone's chiming in and I'm in the middle of talking, but she is someone who is important, who set this up in the first place, so I should answer her. So I did. So I apologize for that disruption. So let me begin again, because now I'm all discombobulated. So anyway, we are awash in a world of information. We live in an information age where information and ideas can be spread at the click of a button, the 160 characters of Twitter. And what that has led to is a proliferation of lies, misinformation, deception, willful deception. And so what I always say to people is that even with me, one of the most important things that anyone can do when being confronted with a set of facts or a set of ideas is to check them themselves. And I always say one general rule of thumb is that if someone is telling you something that seems designed to make you feel outraged or angry, then you especially had better fact check them, because a lot of organizations are making a great deal of profit off of outraging audiences and keeping us in a perpetual state of outrage. There are multiple articles about this, about the state of outrage and the profit models of outrage peddling in America. And why do I say that? I say that because I'm coming to you with a story about journalism, about a journalist, and because I want you to check me even if you are inclined to believe me, to trust me, you should always check me anyway. And one of the most important ways to kind of get a sense of who the person is confronting you with information is say, is this person sharing their sources? Is this person sharing their information? Is this person making it easy for me to fact check him or her or his or her assertions? And I say that because I will be providing links and links and links and links at the end of this video in the comment section that help validate, support, and add additional information to the things that I am sharing with you today about Ida B. Wells Barnett. One of the other things I always say is check the source of your information. We should never automatically believe or disbelieve somebody just based on who they are, one way or another, or what their political agenda might be. Sometimes people we disagree with bring uncomfortable facts that should force us to reevaluate our perceptions. And so I'll tell you who I am. So my name is Joseph Solar. I'm an adjunct, underpaid and overworked professor of history, specifically African American history, at Rowan College of Burlington County. I've been doing these videos since June. For those of you who've been here before, those of you who are new, welcome. I have a PhD in urban education from Temple University and a master's degree from there, where I studied educational policy making and, germane to my earlier discussion, the way political leadership sells policies on education and defines the goals of education and learning to suit their existing agenda. So that was my dissertation work. My undergraduate degree, I attended Harvard University, and I was a double major in history and African American studies. And it was in that African American studies department where I studied with some of the most extraordinary teachers I've ever encountered, like Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, who writes the textbook that I use at RCBC, and Henry Louis Gates Jr., Cornel West, James Randy Mattori, K. Anthony Appiah. I mean, just extraordinary people. And I always say I'd be remiss, at least in the context of African American history, if I did not mention Michelle Bing, one of my grad school sociology professors at Temple, who contributed a lot of ideas and framing to understanding issues of the development of racial ideals and racist ideologies and all sorts of the things we're trying to unwind to create a more just and equitable society. So that's me. But regarding a just and equitable society, which is, of course, hopefully the goal of all people, regardless, I am coming to you to discuss Ida B. Wells Barnett. And I don't even know how I can capture all that this extraordinary woman accomplished in her lifetime in the context of this video. She might be one of the most important people that you don't know enough about in American history. It's that simple. Just as a quick summary, she lived her life as a teacher and a journalist, and she had her fingers on so many different enterprises, so many different movements, and her entire life was dedicated to seeking justice. And in fact, her autobiography from 1928 was called Crusade for Justice. So who is Ida B. Wells Barnett? Who is this extraordinary human that you might have heard a thing or two about, but I suspect you do not know as much as you probably should, because she did everything. She is a towering figure in American history. And if I say it, but I'll stand behind it, if there was a white man who had done as much for as many movements and as many causes as she did, we would be able to drop that person's name, and it would be a name on the mouth of every child in America. But this is, of course, the point with Ida B. Wells Barnett. She is an African American woman, and as a consequence of unfortunate racism, sexism in American society, she does not have the name recognition that she is entitled to because of her extraordinary life. And so, let us begin. Her extraordinary life begins in 1862. So those of you who know the numbers will know that that means Ida B. Wells is born in slavery in the Civil War. She might not have necessarily been born in slavery. She happened to have been born in slavery in Holly Springs, Mississippi. Her parents were enslaved in Mississippi, and in fact her grandfather was their enslaver. This means that her childhood, her earliest years were during the Civil War, which she did not remember, which means that she's growing up into consciousness as a newly freed child of formerly enslaved parents. And we can't underscore this enough, that as far as she would recount or whatever, she doesn't really have memories of slavery, because by the time she is 4 years old, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution has been enacted and slavery has been outlawed, except as punishment for a crime, for those of you who've seen the Netflix special 13. And so she grows up as a child of the Reconstruction, and the Reconstruction period is this extraordinary period of hope and just radical change in American society, which, if it had not been so vicious and savagely attacked and destroyed by white supremacist violence and ultimately neglected by federal government cowardice, as Rayford Logan called it, the betrayal of the Negro, we could be living in a much more just society today. But unfortunately, the Reconstruction is betrayed. Unfortunately, the Ku Klux Klan and the Knights of the White Camellia and these various white terrorist organizations formed by what Dick Cheney would call the dead enders, who refused to acknowledge that slavery was over and that they're going to have to work for themselves. They can no longer force others to do their work for them and take the profit from them. The campaign of terroristic violence by white supremacists in the South had consequences. I've done other videos on Educating for Change. If you haven't seen them, or if you're not aware of Educating for Change, check them out. They cover a broad range of different topics, including Reconstruction and whatnot, and the laws enacted during the Reconstruction to help combat this white terrorism. It is notable that one such law, called the Ku Klux Klan Act, is the law under which currently Mississippi Representative Benny Thompson is suing the former president regarding the events of January 6th. But that's just an aside. So Reconstruction comes to a sad and bitter end as the white supremacists and the pro-slavery people, see, cats, they always love to come when you're doing something, as white supremacists take back power in the southern states. She is still living in Mississippi. Her parents continue to have children. There are lots of children, I think maybe like a dozen kids. But in 1878, so a year after the deal is struck that ends Reconstruction because of the election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden, there is a yellow fever outbreak in the Mississippi Delta land. And I did a video on yellow fever in Philadelphia in 1793. It seems that yellow fever epidemics are a feature of American life, but there also seems to be this definite connection between significant people and significant events in American history, African American history, connected to the yellow fever. In this case, Wells, her parents die of the yellow fever epidemic, because they are nursing and caring for the sick who are suffering from the disease. Now, yellow fever is not person-to-person transmissible. It's a mosquito-borne illness, but the Delta land is a giant swamp, and so, as you can imagine, it is rife with mosquito-borne contagion. Ida B. Wells is 16 at the time when she loses her parents. She's the oldest child, and friends and family members, in trying to deal with the aftermath, decide that they're going to split the kids up so that they can be raised. Ida B. Wells decides that she is not going to allow the children to be split up. One of the extraordinary things about her at this point, 16 years old, is that she had been in schools and learning up to that point. So had her mother. She'd gone to school with her mother. Because one of the great outcomes, one of the great advances of the Reconstruction era was the establishment of public schooling in the southern states. They did not effectively have any sort of public school system in the antebellum and Civil War period because, like many things, their politics is so distorted by slavery, and we'll hear more on that later, that they refused to advance a general system of public education because they were worried that the people they kept enslaved would benefit from it. After slavery, of course, everyone has the opportunity, and these educational opportunities were given to white and black alike, and so many poor whites received an education for the first time. Ida B. Wells, educated, obviously brilliant, as we'll see from the rest of her life, decides she is not going to allow her family, her siblings, to be split up, and so she drops out of school. She makes herself seem older, and she applies for a job as a school teacher. Now, at this time, to be a public school teacher, and I told you I did urban education, so it's kind of my thing, one merely had to have completed the grade to teach the grade. So as a 16-year-old, based on our current system, she might have been like a 10th grader. And what that means is that she was, after a couple classes or whatever, qualified to teach up to 10th grade, which most people didn't even make it to 10th grade. So she could teach in a one-room schoolhouse, K through 8, or first grade through 8th grade stuff. There's no kindergarten in the South. So she becomes a teacher to keep her family together. And after a couple of years, she moves to the city of Memphis, which of course is the major city connected to the Mississippi Delta land, even today, because she had a chance at better wages and better life opportunities for herself and her family in Memphis. Memphis was a boom town. We see after the Civil War a mass migration of formerly enslaved people to major cities seeking jobs. And of course, white supremacist violence follows them. In fact, Memphis in 1866 was the scene of one of the first racial pogroms in the United States. And I call them pogroms because we tend to call them riots, and riot tends to imply a sort of even playing field. But what happened in Memphis in 1866 was that a group of decommissioned Confederate soldiers and Memphis police attacked decommissioning black Union soldiers and murdered them and burned the entire Memphis neighborhood to the ground where African Americans had been living. The city had bounced back, and as it always would, Tulsa as well. And Ida B. Wells becomes a school teacher there. She's now what we call the age majority. She's 18, she's an adult. She joins a club as a teacher called the Lyceum, a literary organization, a literary society, where she and fellow African-American teachers could meet to discuss and talk about issues and politics and whatnot. The kind of underappreciated reality in terms of American history is that after 1877, after the Reconstruction ends, it doesn't mean the end of black political life or black power or even black voting and other civil rights in the southern states. And it would be another decade before African Americans are forced out of power and before the Jim Crow system of segregation and apartheid is imposed in the South, starting in Mississippi, I might add, and then spreading everywhere else. So there is an educated class of African American teachers and professionals. There are still voting opportunities for African Americans in parts of the South, and so she is in this space. They quickly recognize her talent, and they make her editor of their newspaper. And she is already turning heads with her brilliance. What begins the destruction of rights is that the Supreme Court in 1883, I believe, check me on that. I did a video on it, so there's another video somewhere. They overturned the Civil Rights Act of 1872. Yeah, 74. They overturned the Civil Rights Acts, which had been passed under President Grant and the Republican, the then radical, as they were called, radical Republican administration, Congress. And so these Civil Rights Acts had protected African American rights until the Supreme Court tossed them out and said that the U.S. government has no right to protect people's civil rights or enforce social equality. So after 1883 and the civil rights cases, we see a steady erosion of civil rights. And Ida B. Wells, she is not going to take it laying down or sitting. Well, she did take it sitting down. I'll tell you more about that in a second. The very year after the Civil Rights Acts are overturned, the Memphis streetcars and trains impose segregation laws and segregation rules, segregating black from white passengers. In 1884, Ida B. Wells is taking a train, and she sits down in the ladies' car, as it was called, because we had gender-segregated cars, like Iran does, and she is told that she needs to leave and that she can go sit in the smoking car. Now, of course, social norms dictated that women weren't allowed to smoke, so in other words, she had to go sit in a men's car that was full of smoke. She says no, because this is the ladies' car, and she is a lady, and so she's going to sit in the ladies' car. She is, just to remind you, 22 years old at this point. So the conductor attempts to remove her forcibly, and as she puts it, she fastened her teeth firmly in his arm. She fights back, and so they call for help, and eventually multiple men, white men, will grab her and forcibly throw her off the train for sitting in the ladies' car. She wrote an account of this incident and had it published in Memphis in a newspaper called the Memphis Free Speech. And she took the railroad company to court. And she won and was awarded damages for what occurred to her. But of course, the railroad company appealed and appealed. And of course, the Supreme Court will overturn her victory and toss it out. And so she loses justice. Her account of what happened to her and her case attracts nationwide attention because, of course, it was somebody challenging racial segregation right near the beginning of it. Now, Philadelphia had already had streetcar boycotts, which led to integration on their streetcars and whatnot, so it's not like this is a brand new thing, but this was a 22-year-old black woman refusing to give up her seat. Sound familiar, anyone? Refusing to give up her seat in what was supposed to be a whites-only car to move to an area where she was allowed on the basis of her skin, and she actually wins her case before then losing her case in the Supreme Court. It goes across the wires and is picked up by black newspapers throughout America, and she becomes famous. She's given a column in the Memphis Free Speech, and she signs this column Iola. And in this column, she writes about issues in Memphis. One of the major issues in Memphis at the time was corruption in the public school systems and poor conditions in a lot of Memphis public schools. As a consequence of this, she gets fired from her teaching job, and that's when she's named the editor of the Memphis Free Speech. So here you have a situation where this woman is a school teacher, and they try to silence her by firing her, and instead they just gave her a megaphone, and it led to her becoming the editor of the newspaper and becoming, already at this point in her mid-20s, a journalistic voice for racial equality. She persists, because nevertheless she persisted in this course at the Memphis Free Speech, writing articles discussing kind of the oncoming segregation and issues in the black community, and issues, race issues and politics and whatever, for years. Oftentimes writing accounts seeking out to describe the increasing violence that African Americans were faced with in southern states, in Memphis, as a consequence of the white supremacist element attempting to remove African Americans from public life. And so the Memphis Free Speech of the 1880s is a newspaper that we would today call muckraking, because it's doing investigative journalism about racial violence in Memphis. Everything changes for her in 1892. She was already renowned at this point and had traveled the country here and there to speak and address organizations and black organizations throughout the South. But 1892 is a turning point. A friend of hers, Thomas Moss, opens up a grocery store with Will Stewart and Calvin McDowell. And this grocery store, or food co-op, was in direct competition with a white grocery store. And there is an issue, as there always somehow tended to be when black businesses were becoming successful and competing with white businesses. Supposedly with a woman who was the McDowell or one of the men laid hands on her, or some. You can never trust these accounts after the fact. So many were exposed as falsehoods. Many of them exposed as falsehoods by Ida B. Wells Barnett herself. And so that night, plainclothes police come to the store, and the three men attempt to defend themselves, and they open fire on this group of, as far as they were concerned, marauders. But as soon as the men identify themselves as cops, they lay down their arms. The men are arrested, thrown in jail. And the next day, the Memphis Commercial newspaper, and the Memphis Appeal, the white newspapers, spoke of black rebellion and Negro conspiracy in the city of Memphis against the white community. And this is another common trope, that those people are the ones trying to do the issues that we did. And so a mob assembles. They assault the jail where the three men were being held for trial for goodness knows what charges, and they murder the three men. They lynch them. The mob then turns on other parts of Memphis and other businesses. The police arrest only African Americans, even though, of course, they were the victims of the violence. And it's a disaster. Ida B. Wells, obviously, is very upset by this. This is a friend of hers. This has been her issue. She is exposing the injustices occurring against African Americans. And so she writes the expose about what a good man he was, a father. He was a good husband. He was a good father. He had kids. And she even says directly in the newspaper that the only crime these men committed was competing against a white-owned business. She then advises the black community of Memphis that this is not the place to be. We need to go. And she advises the people of Memphis to leave Memphis for Oklahoma. And this is how it connects to Tulsa, because what are the numbers? Thousands of African Americans sold their homes, their businesses, their property, and they moved to Oklahoma because of the articles Ida B. Wells was publishing in the Memphis Free Speech. And so thousands are going to Oklahoma. But as we know, racial violence and pogroms would follow them there in Tulsa in 1921. We're approaching the 100th anniversary. So she is highly influential. But now the white community is very upset at her because, of course, they were making money off the black community. And Ida B. Wells and her persuasive writing and her editorializing in the newspaper was depriving these white-owned businesses of their customers. And so they had first attempted to murder competing black businesses, and now, of course, they're losing their customer base. And so, as you can imagine, they're not particularly fond of Ida B. Wells. She turns it up a notch when she actually organizes a citywide boycott by African Americans of the Memphis trolley system because they were in cahoots with the establishment that protected lynchers. And so 1892 generally is the time when we can say Ida B. Wells becomes a crusader against lynching. And it would be one of the defining issues of her entire life, arguing against the extrajudicial, mass, almost carnival, festival atmosphere of murdering black and brown people mostly. But she even commented on the lynching murder of Leo Frank in Atlanta in 1913, who was Jewish, because whatever people could get away with, whatever crimes people get away with committing on African Americans will always go beyond African Americans. She becomes a crusader. Her organization of the boycott and her publishing of the articles about the grocery store, in which she basically said to the men, or said to the leaders, that the only reason why you attack these men is they're better businessmen than you, and you were afraid of their competition because they're good at it. Well, these editorials were too much for the good people of Memphis, and when she is on her way to Boston to give a speech, because of course she's already famous at this point, a mob attacks the offices of the Memphis Free Speech and destroy the offices. Had she been there, she might very well have been murdered too. And from 1892, Ida B. Wells is essentially persona non grata in the South. She has a price on her head. She would be killed. But of course, she's Ida B. Wells Barnett. And so immediately she bounces back. She's hired for the New York Age newspaper by T. Thomas Fortune, another one of these great African-American muckraking journalists, and immediately lands on her feet. He sends her to Chicago for the Columbian Exposition in 1893. And the Columbian Exposition of 1893, the one immortalized in the Devil in the White City novel, is one in which African Americans did not appear. So the Columbian Exposition was meant to show off, 400 years since Columbus and look at the great progress America has made. And Ida B. Wells is like, interesting that you're talking about all this progress and you don't even acknowledge the fact that millions of African Americans, free and enslaved, did a great deal of the labor that built this country. So she, along with a certain Frederick Douglass and a certain W.E.B. Du Bois, and a man called Ferdinand Barnett, begin complaining about the lack of representation of African Americans at the fair. And they publish a pamphlet which they give out to all the foreign guests, saying, how come Negroes are not represented at the fair? Why is America trying to pretend we don't exist and we made no contributions? Why does America not want you to look at us? The pamphlet is a smash success. She embarrasses the organizers. Unfortunately, it leads to what they call Negro Day at the fair, but that's a whole other story of just disgusting racism on the part of the fair organizers. But she now has met this guy, Ferdinand Barnett, who's a Chicago attorney, and she will settle in Chicago with Ferdinand Barnett eventually. 1895. And she will marry him. By this point, though, she has become even more prominent. And after the exposition, she begins doing investigative journalism about lynching in America. And she is seen so often, she saw firsthand what happened in Memphis, that individuals will make up stories to justify murdering black people. There's just no way around it. And she herself says in her autobiography that even though she thought lynching was wrong, she had nonetheless believed that those who were lynched might have done something wrong anyway, who deserved it, and just that we needed to have more of a fair justice system to ensure that these men saw justice the right way, due process, etc. But after her friend was murdered, she realized it was a lie, and that these lynchings always had some sort of additional motivation behind them, not just some supposed accusation of crime, disrespecting a white woman, whistling at a white woman, touching a white woman, raping a white woman. Same nonsense every time. And she begins investigating the data and the information and tracking down witnesses. And in 1895, she publishes A Red Record, her first book. And this book is so systematic. This is probably because she and Du Bois were friends. This is almost to the level of a sociological study of lynching. Data, information, facts, evidence. This is what I'm saying, or what I said at the beginning of the video, that it's so important to understand facts, data, and information, that verifiable facts matter when someone is making an assertion. Ida B. Wells Barnett in 1895 understood this, and she knew that if she was going to demonstrate the injustice of Americans' racist system and lynchings, she would need the evidence. And so she brought the evidence, she published the evidence, and it exposed the crimes that America was committing. She then, after marrying Ferdinand Barnett in 1895, she then purchased a newspaper in Chicago, The Conservator, which was the first black newspaper in Chicago and which had belonged to a certain Ferdinand Barnett. So again, when you think about, we always make that joke behind every good man is a good woman or whatever. Yeah, behind every good woman's a good man. Because this man, Ferdinand Barnett, he marries her and he commits to supporting her work. He sells her his newspaper, and she becomes the editor of his newspaper and settles in Chicago. They begin having kids, but before having kids, she goes to London to speak. Because of her Red Record, the book, and because of her pamphlet, The World's Fair, she attracts international attention. And of course, London was the capital of the largest empire on Earth. They were the superpower, or one of the superpowers on Earth. And so British opinion mattered. And what happened is that Ida B. Wells speaking to her, Ida B. Wells Barnett now, her speaking to her throughout London and in England leads to the forming of the London Anti-Lynching Committee. And so before there were formal anti-lynching organizations in the United States, there was an anti-lynching organization in England dedicated to exposing and shaming American crime against American people. While settled in Chicago, she begins to recognize and associate with the women's suffrage advocates as well. She becomes a friend of Susan B. Anthony, acquaintance of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she begins to argue what we today will call intersectionality, that there's something that's especially challenging to be a black woman. And she begins writing articles and exposing the injustices that black women were subject to in courting, especially a specific racist stereotype that was promulgated in the media of this black Jezebel. And so in the context of trying to kind of impose racial segregation and Jim Crow, there was an entire propaganda campaign waged against African Americans. So black men were viewed as sexual predators, or excuse me, were defined as sexual predators going after white women, but black women were sexual seductresses who were always seducing the white men, right? You see what they're doing there, right? White men had for hundreds of years through the institution of slavery sexually abused and raped black women. And so the propaganda says it wasn't rape, these women, these black women are sluts. But if black men were in a relationship with a white woman, that it was obviously rape because black men are sexual predators. Ida B. Wells is very cognizant that these two forces are related. She knows what they're doing. And so her point, of course, is to defend the good nature and the good name of black women. And, as she would later do, and which would get her in trouble, I've got the book available, I'll link it. She exposes the truth that many lynchings of black men in which the black man was accused of raping the white woman, that in fact either no rape had happened or there had been a consensual relationship between the black man and the white woman. And she says, I'm paraphrasing here slyly, so white men better be careful, because if they keep bringing attention to this issue, it will soon become apparent that though they themselves have for centuries lusted after quadroons and octoroons, her words, not mine, that why should it be so surprising to them that their wives would want the same thing that they want, except a black man or a quadroon man or an octoroon man, and that the more they bring attention to it, the more they are in danger of undercutting their own manhood in the eyes of the public. This is the 1890s. She did not spare feelings. She called this crap out directly. She wasn't going to... No, she wasn't going to play with this game. And so she's basically like, look, you like black women? Guess what? White women like black men. And guess what? If you have to kill the black man because you think he's a threat, because you think the white woman will like him more than you, maybe you need to check the type of man you are. She's awesome. She's awesome. So during this time in Chicago, she begins having her kids and raising her family, running this newspaper, and of course engaging in this muckraking journalism, and also corresponding and working with the women's suffrage advocates. The women's suffrage movement had been largely, I don't want to say dormant, but they had been working on a sort of state-by-state agenda, and so various states in the West had given women the right to vote, but the East and the South had been completely shut out. She, through her correspondence, becomes friends with and allies of the editor of the Boston Guardian, which is another black newspaper. Monroe Trotter is the editor, and with Du Bois, of course. And she becomes part of the so-called radical movement for civil rights. And this radical movement, of course, Du Bois, Trotter, even T. Thomas Fortune, actually. These were the individuals, excuse me, Mary Church Terrell, I'll talk about her in another video, who argued that the proper way forward was a strident and strenuous assertion of equality and non-stop agitation for equal civil rights. The flip side is the Booker T. Washington side, which I did a video on Booker T. Washington months ago that's on Educating for Change. Booker T. Washington had more of a cautious and accommodationist. He's like, we don't need civil rights, just leave us alone, stop killing us, etc. And so they have clashes and fights and arguments within their movement, as happens very often. Within social movements, there's always going to be a radical faction and a moderate faction. A change now and a change eventually faction. She is with the change now faction. As she continues with her exposés and her work exposing, she publishes another book about an incident in New Orleans and a man named Robert Charles. I don't remember her position on the Spanish-American War. She even goes to the White House and has a meeting with William McKinley, the Republican president from 1896 to, 1904? Or it would have been 1904, but he was assassinated. Sorry, 1892. I don't remember. She has a meeting with McKinley, and she lectures him and tells him that he needs to do more for black civil rights. The last Republican president who had tried anything for black civil rights had been James Garfield in 1881, and then he'd been assassinated, and black civil rights finished dying, or began the march to death. So she is bold. She is moving forward. As you can imagine, I mean, her kids are all geniuses as well. She attends the meeting at Niagara Falls in 1907, which leads to the signing of a charter for the so-called Niagara Movement, which becomes the NAACP, the National Association of Advancement of Colored People. She's one of 2 women to sign the forming document of the NAACP. But she is kind of forced out of the leadership of the organization. There could be many reasons. As you can imagine, the rampant sexism of American society meant that she had to deal with a lot of people who thought she was out of her lane as a woman, as well as out of her lane as a black woman. She's hurt by this, and then so from this point forward, she moves back to Chicago, and she begins working. She creates an organization called the Negro Fellowship League, and the goal of this organization is to help African Americans move into Chicago to find work and to stabilize themselves, right? Because remember, this is the woman who years before had advocated moving out of the South and moving out of places where racial violence is being committed against you and start a new life somewhere. And so even before the Great Migration brings thousands of African Americans to Chicago, there were African Americans already coming to Chicago, and she wanted to help them settle and adjust with the Negro Fellowship League. She also becomes more concerned and active with the women's suffrage movement. And what happens in 1913 is that as part of her agitation for women's suffrage, she will help elect the first black elected official in the entire North. Oscar DePriest is elected alderman for the city of Chicago because Ida B. Wells Barnett helps organize the votes of African American men and the organizing skills of African American women. And then she forms the Alpha Suffrage Club to help ensure that those African American women get the vote. Her activities with regards to suffrage, her success, her political savvy in helping DePriest get elected definitely attracted attention. In 1913, the year Woodrow Wilson is set to be inaugurated as a supposedly progressive Democratic president of the United States, but actually a racist hypocrite from Virginia, but also president of Princeton, elected out of New Jersey. And he's put on blast by women that he is going to have to help women get the right to vote. He is evasive on the issue. And so a New Jersey native, Alice Paul, whose home and the Alice Paul Institute happens to be around the corner from Rowan College of Burlington County, where I teach, just to show you just how everybody is all, it's mind-blowing how close all these people are. Anna Howard Shaw, the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, lives in Media, Pennsylvania. So Alice Paul organizes a parade in D.C. that's going to take place the day before Wilson's inauguration to press Woodrow Wilson and the federal government to pass a federal suffrage amendment to the U.S. Constitution to grant all women the right to vote. Alice Paul meets with anyone and everyone. She's a Quaker. But when she gets to D.C. to organize the march, the white D.C. gentlewomen tell her that this is Washington. This is a southern city. You cannot have black women march with you. You cannot have an integrated parade. That will sabotage the cause. That will lead to violence. That will, etc., etc., etc. In other words, Southern women suffragettes were still, as much as they wanted women's equality, they were still committed to white supremacy. But also, they were afraid of offending the white supremacists who might vote in favor of their right to vote. The whole history of the suffrage movements and the abolition movement is another extraordinary story of cooperation, betrayal, back and forth. The first prominent advocate of women's suffrage, male advocate of women's suffrage, was Frederick Douglass, just to give you a sense of it. So, Alice Paul, when the Chicago delegation arrives on a special chartered train, Ida B. Wells is among the white women there to march. And Alice Paul tells her, you can't march with us because you're black. We're afraid that Washington will be offended by our movement, that it will undercut the cause of women's suffrage if we advocate for racial equality at the same or if we allow racial equality at the same time. And as you can imagine, Ida B. Wells is terribly upset by this, offended. She has worked so hard. She has worked with the suffragists. And in fact, part of what happens in Illinois is women in Illinois are granted the right to vote in 1913, in part because of the work that Ida B. Wells Barnett did, organizing black male voters in support of women's suffrage. So she's told she cannot vote. You can't. Blah. The parade goes off, and Ida B. Wells Barnett is not there. But despite the fact that it was a racially segregated parade, there is still violence. Men begin throwing rocks and attacking the women, the peaceful women marching for their right to vote. And it's clear from documentary, photo, and video evidence that the D.C. police stood by or even laughed as these women are being physically and violently assaulted by a mostly male mob because of their arguing for the right to vote. In the middle of this chaos, Ida B. Wells does something, again, Ida B. Wells, extraordinary. Halfway through the parade, she just slips in out of the crowd and joins the Illinois delegation, and she marches with the white Illinois women on behalf of women's suffrage for the remainder of the parade. After the assault on peaceful women protesters, while cops stood by doing nothing, there is a Senate inquiry into police misconduct regarding the women's suffrage parade. And of course, the story of women's suffrage from there on is another extraordinary story in and of itself. And the work of the Black Women's Club movement, Mary Church Terrell, and Ida B. Wells' participation with these women as well. When women finally get the right to vote, Ida B. Wells Barnett, besides voting, is a prominent Republican Party organizer in the South Side of Chicago because, of course, back then the Republican Party was the party most associated with civil rights for African Americans. It begins to change in the 1920s, incidentally. Becomes a lot less clear and a lot more blurry. But during the war, she is supportive of the rights of black soldiers and supportive of the war effort, make the world free of democracy. But of course, like most of the black intelligentsia and black writing class, she is very clear to point out the hypocrisy of Woodrow Wilson declaring the war to be for democracy when women don't have the right to vote, and African American men often don't have the right to vote and are met with violence and racial segregation in their daily lives if they try to vote or assert themselves. Woodrow Wilson is not someone I have a lot of respect for because he's a hypocrite, because the federal workforce had been integrated. Woodrow Wilson imposes Jim Crow segregation on the federal workforce when he becomes president. He screens the movie Birth of a Nation, which leads directly to a rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. The NAACP organizes a boycott and protest campaign against this film. Ida B. Wells, again, she is part of this, writing against this movie, participating in pickets and boycotts, or encouraging others to do so with this film, this racist defensive film. And then, of course, when there is an uprising by black soldiers in Houston as a consequence of ongoing discrimination and second-class treatment in the U.S. military. Oh, very happy, Aaron. She takes up the cause of these black soldiers, and she exposes kind of the violence and the abuse that black soldiers are subject to in the U.S. Army, even as, of course, they are being sent abroad to die in the trenches in France in defense of democracy. And yet they can't even eat in a local restaurant or even vote in the states where they live in the South. And so she will write on behalf of them and continue. It was Camp Logan, I'm not sure if I said the name, Camp Logan uprising in Houston, and again called a race riot, but it was essentially a mutiny. When the NAACP's magazine The Crisis comes out with a special issue on behalf of suffrage, Oscar DePriest, the first black alderman in Chicago's history and the first black elected official in the entire North, he writes on behalf of women's suffrage, because of course it was a woman who helped get him his job. And so she continues working. She eventually returns to the South in 1922. She goes to Arkansas after the Elaine massacre. So again, another organized pogrom. And for those of you who don't know, pogrom is the term used for these organized Russian assaults on Jewish communities in the 1890s and early 1900s, in which Jewish towns and villages would be attacked, plundered, burned, and Jewish people would be murdered by elements of the Russian Tsar and Cossacks and whatever. So it's your first kind of anti-Semitic violence is the pogrom. But we like to call our incidents riots. But when an organized mob attacks and burns down an entire section of town just because people who live there are black, or as we call it today, they go down to burn the ghetto, and ghetto was the Italian word for the Jewish neighborhoods in Venice. So I'm just connecting these ideas together. It's a pogrom, and the United States has a long history of pogroms against black communities. So in Elaine, farmers were trying to organize for better prices for their crops because, of course, since African Americans don't have the vote and they don't have rights in the southern states, they're constantly being cheated and abused by business leaders and business people. As they begin this plan to boycott or to, in a sense, strike and not sell their cotton to the local white purchasers, there is an organized assault on this meeting of these sharecroppers, and they are murdered for attempting to get fair prices for their crops and to not be discriminated against by being black farmers. As you can imagine, this is defined as a police action against a black conspiracy for a blah, 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 and a dozen of the victims of this racist assault are sentenced to death for conspiracy and plotting uprisings in Elaine County, Arkansas. Ida B. Wells goes south, still undercover because there is still a death warrant on her head. And she meets with these men, and she takes up their cause and advocates and writes and tells their side of the story and explains what happened. And again, you know, they just swept Elaine, Arkansas under the mat. But in 1920s, Ida B. Wells Barnett, as is the brilliant journalist she is, the investigative journalist she is, bringing the receipts, bringing the facts, she changes the story. And in 1923, the United States Supreme Court overturns the convictions and overturns the death sentences meted out to these 12 victims of the crime. She will continue her work through the 1920s and eventually write her autobiography in 1928 because people wanted to read it. And she will die in 1931, but not before leaving behind one of the most extraordinary legacies of transformational journalism, of investigative prowess, of commitment to facts and justice for all people. She is an advocate for racial equality. She is an advocate for gender equality. And she is one of the greatest Americans, hard stop, period. Her use of nonviolent tactics, of boycotts, of immigration, of the power of her pen is obviously a source, a thread, an inspiration for the modern civil rights movement. She was Rosa Parks 100 years, well, 80 years before Rosa Parks was Rosa Parks. And guaranteed Rosa Parks knew of Ida B. Wells Barnett when she sat down on that bus and did what Ida B. Wells Barnett had done in Memphis. And so Ida B. Wells is a force of nature, and she's one of the most important people in our history. We definitely need to know who she is and understand her and appreciate her. So I'm going to call it an end here. I made it in under an hour. I have, so many links to share. Tons. I have the text of some of her books. I've got historic sites where she lived. The Houston uprising. Yeah. I've got tons of stuff. Tons of stuff. So after I end this video, look to the comment section beneath this video, and I'm going to start putting up those links and telling you what's there so that you can see it all. You can check me, but really, because I know that I come to you intellectually honest and sharing facts, not so you can check me, so that you can learn deeper and so that you can appreciate this extraordinary, inspiring, mind-blowingly awesome American citizen. All right, does anybody have any quick questions for me? No? All right. Well, thank you for joining me. Aaron, I don't know if you're still here or not. Thank you so much for your comment. And I will see you all here next week. I'm not sure if I'm doing Mary Church Terrell or Fanny Jackson Coppin, but I'll be here with someone and I'll create an event and you'll know what my topic's going to be. Have a wonderful day and stay safe in this cold, snowy weather. Take care all and farewell.